Let's go Ravens! Something feels completely different inside the Ravens building this offseason, and according to someone who has been there every step of the way, the atmosphere has changed in ways fans haven't been able to fully see from the outside. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, this organization is moving forward under new leadership. Naturally, that brings excitement. It brings questions. It brings uncertainty. But perhaps the biggest surprise isn't simply that there's a new head coach. It's what people inside the building are saying about the environment since that change happened. Because when someone who has been covering the Ravens every single day begins describing the current atmosphere as a breath of fresh air, you can't help but wonder what's really different behind those doors. Before we continue, make sure you've already hit the like button if you're excited to see this new era of Ravens football begin. And let's fill the comments with positivity today. Comment below. Go Ravens! The future is bright! I want to see how many members of Ravens flock believe this new chapter could bring out the best version of this football team. Now let's get into what was said. The conversation centered around one of the biggest changes in franchise history. After 18 seasons under John Harbaugh, the Ravens have officially entered a new era with Jesse Minter leading the organization. According to the discussion, the decision to move on from Harbaugh surprised many people because there had long been a belief that if his time with Baltimore ever ended, it would happen on his own terms rather than through a decision made by the organization. That alone tells you how significant this transition has been. But what came next may have been even more revealing. According to the discussion, while there was certainly an element of surprise, there was also a feeling that the relationship between the organization and Harbaugh had simply reached its natural conclusion. The comparison used described it as a relationship where both sides may already know it's time to move on, yet continue together until the situation eventually becomes impossible to ignore. It's a powerful comparison, because it suggests this wasn't just one disappointing season. It was the accumulation of several years that ultimately led to a major organizational decision. The discussion also reflected on last season. According to the conversation, the year simply never felt like a typical Ravens season. Injuries certainly played a role, but there was also a sense that something wasn't working the way people had become accustomed to seeing in Baltimore. Missing the playoffs after entering the season with high expectations became part of the reason why such a dramatic change eventually occurred. But once Jesse Minter arrived, another theme immediately began emerging. Energy, fresh ideas, new voices, and perhaps most importantly, new communication. Now, the discussion was also careful to add an important reminder. It's still June. Training camp hasn't started. No meaningful games have been played. The description used was that the organization is currently in what many would call the honeymoon phase. Everything is new. Everything feels exciting. Everyone is optimistic. And naturally, that creates a positive atmosphere throughout the building. But even with that disclaimer, there were still several noticeable differences being discussed. One phrase stood out above everything else. A breath of fresh air. According to the conversation, that expression has been used to describe how some people inside the organization feel following the coaching change. After spending so many years under the same leadership, the arrival of younger coaches and a different style of communication appears to have created a noticeably different atmosphere around the team. That doesn't necessarily mean everything will automatically translate into victories. The discussion specifically acknowledged that there will still be legitimate questions once real games begin. After all, this is a first-time head coach. There are coaches taking on new responsibilities. And experience is something that only develops over time. But one area where the new staff has already made an impression is communication. According to the discussion, players have spoken positively about understanding exactly what coaches expect from them. There was also a conversation about how the communication style of younger coaches can sometimes feel easier for players to relate to, creating an environment where expectations are understood more clearly. And perhaps that's one of the biggest themes emerging from this entire offseason. Clarity. Not just new schemes. Not just new coaches. But clear communication. Clear expectations. Clear attention to detail. Because according to the discussion, those were areas the organization wanted to improve immediately after the coaching transition. One specific example highlighted this perfectly. The coaching staff has reportedly placed a strong emphasis on details during practice, including late practice situations designed around performing at your best when your best is needed. According to the discussion, that focus directly addresses an issue many people believed had affected the Ravens in recent seasons. And that's where this story becomes especially interesting. Because this isn't simply about changing coaches. It's about changing habits, changing preparation, changing communication, changing the little things that can eventually influence much bigger moments later in the season. But perhaps the most encouraging comments weren't actually about the offense at all. They were about the defense. The conversation became even more revealing when it shifted toward the defense, because according to what was shared, this may be the area where the biggest differences are already being noticed. And that's saying a lot considering it's still only the offseason. One of the first topics discussed was attention to detail. According to the conversation, the defensive players aren't simply learning a new system. They're being encouraged to ask questions immediately. If there's confusion, it gets addressed right away. If there's a mistake, coaches correct it immediately instead of allowing it to carry over into the next rep. That approach has reportedly become one of the defining characteristics of this new coaching staff. And honestly, Ravens fans, that may sound like a small thing. But sometimes the smallest details end up making the biggest difference, especially on defense. Because defensive football depends on communication, timing, assignments, everyone being exactly where they're supposed to be. If one player is late, if one player misunderstands an assignment, if one player lines up incorrectly, the entire play can fall apart. According to the discussion, that is exactly why so much emphasis is being placed on correcting mistakes as soon as they happen. Nothing gets ignored. Nothing gets pushed aside. Everything becomes a teaching opportunity. Another fascinating point involved the way players have responded to that coaching style. The discussion suggested that everyone currently seems eager to learn. Not just the younger players. Everyone. Players are reportedly asking questions even when they haven't made mistakes because they simply want to understand the system better before training camp begins. That's an encouraging sign. Because learning doesn't stop once practice ends. The more players understand the system now, the better prepared they'll be when the competition becomes more intense. Then came perhaps the strongest statement of the entire interview. According to the discussion, the defense currently looks like the strongest side of the football team heading into the new season. That's a bold opinion, especially considering the amount of change taking place throughout the organization. But it wasn't presented as a random prediction. Several reasons were given to support that belief. One of the biggest involved the defensive line. According to the discussion, the investment made up front could have a significant impact on every level of the defense. The idea is straightforward. If the defensive line creates more pressure, if it controls the line of scrimmage more consistently, then the linebackers benefit, the secondary benefits. The entire defense becomes more effective because fewer players are forced to compensate for breakdowns elsewhere. That concept continued throughout the conversation. Instead of asking the secondary to cover for extended periods, instead of constantly putting pressure on the back end of the defense, a stronger front could naturally improve everything behind it. Of course, there was also honesty about where things currently stand. The discussion acknowledged that not every defensive starter has consistently been on the field together throughout off-season practices. Because of that, nobody is claiming to know exactly what the finished product will look like. There is still work to do. There is still chemistry to build. There are still questions that can only be